The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to start by saying that when I become overwhelmed with volume of work, I oftentimes take a little bit of a breather, and usually that breather often happens in Cape Breton Richmond, and the person that I usually go to ask for advice to people are usually my parents, who have been my very good friends my whole life. And as one of those individuals are no longer with me this weekend, when I was trying to sift through all this vast amount of information that had been imposed on us last week with Bill 72, and I was feeling as if you really needed to be a lawyer to be able to get through all that information and all the intricacies and details. I actually took a drive as I was home. J'étais chez moi à l'île Madame. I took a drive and I actually went to the site where my own education began at North Almadam Elementary. And behind the school, therein lies the graveyard. And in that graveyard is buried my dad. So I went up there and I asked him for some advice as far as what I should do here, because there definitely is, there are details in this bill for which I think can actually afford a great deal of reform that's needed within the school system. But also it's the entire idea that this bill takes upon us or brings upon us that takes away the very democratic right of the people of this province. And that's the first thing that I saw going through this bill. Not a lawyer, but I'm an avid reader, as are many people in this House. We have to be. But in taking a look at this bill, the first thing that I saw was basically the erosion of our democratic process by eliminating a democratically elected institution, which is the school boards. And going back to my basic civics class of grades 7 and 8, Mrs. McLean, bless her heart, grades 7 and 8, this is not the democracy that I was taught in junior high. I would have never for a moment thought that we, in a democratic system as we have, and we are so proud that we are a responsible government, that we could ever be in a position, a government could ever be in a position to completely abolish a democratic institution. Now, whether or not you actually agree or disagree with the efficacy of the school boards, that makes no difference here. That's not what we're discussing here. What we're discussing, and I want to actually make certain that everybody takes away from this, is that we are giving away something that we will never be able to get back today. We will never be able to get back this democratic institution, and I believe it's a very slippery slope. It's a very slippery slope. As I was driving here today, and the wind was howling on Hollis Street, and I thought my Jeep was going to take off because the wind was catching it so badly underneath, and the snow was starting to fall. I actually started thinking about all the teachers who came and marched on this House in ways that we have never seen before in the history of this province to let us know, or I should say, let you know, because I wasn't here at that time, their displeasure in the way that this government was treating them. Teachers have become politicians. They become politically active in ways that we've never seen in 120 years. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that besides the erosion of democracy, for which I believe the people of this province should be yelling from the rooftops to say, stop, you will not take my right away to be able to actually elect a school board member. You will not take away an elected body of officials that are only halfway through their mandate. You will not take away an institution that we had fought for. We have fought wars over these types of things, Mr. Speaker, and we are giving it away today. Today will be the last straw. It's a slippery slope, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to ask the people of this province to stand up, be brave, find your voice, and yell from the rooftops if you have to, and in this House, and say, no, you will not take my democratic voice away. Why are we not yelling this? Why are we allowing this to occur? Why? Apathy, I think, Mr. Speaker. We feel as if there's nothing that we can do to stop it. How is it that we've become a people in a democracy that feel that we have no power? We have no power. We do. We do have power. We have power through voting, but we also have power to be able to say no. And we can stop this. The people of this province can stop this. As far as I'm concerned, there's a hole that exists within our so-called democracy in this province, because something that is so valuable and that is irreplaceable, I believe should be put to the people in the way of a binding referendum in order to be able to decide to completely abolish an elected institution. It should not be a government that has a majority to decide such a thing. It should be the people, all the people of this province, because as my colleague here mentioned, I believe there's only about 20 or 25% of the population of Nova Scotia who actually agree that this government should be the government of this province. It's a little bit concerning to me, as it should be concerning to all people in Nova Scotia, that a government that only represents the voice in a vote of 20 to 25% of the people get the decision or make the decision for the rest of us and how we want to actually see our democracy progress, or should I say, regress. Because I think today, Mr. Speaker, on what extraordinarily is International Women's Day, that we are taking such steps backwards. We are taking steps backwards today. It was not that long ago, in fact, I think it was probably about 100 years ago, that I wouldn't have been able to come into this House and take this seat. I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a voice. I wasn't considered a person. And more so than that, I and my family were Acadians. We are Acadians. That makes it even worse, Mr. Speaker. If you want to talk about inequality, let's talk about some of the minority people in this province, some of the founding members of this province, granted, and the hardships that they have had to go through in order to get their voices heard in a democratic system. It's not that long ago, in fact, that it may be 100 years ago that women were enfranchised in Nova Scotia, but I believe it was only in the 1960s that Indigenous people, First Nations people, were able to actually vote in this province and have a vote in this province. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with when that occurred for African Nova Scotians, but I'm sure that there was probably a great deal of difficulty in getting their voice to the table as well. It's the first time that I mention this, Mr. Speaker, because for years, it was hard enough to be an Acadian in this province, let alone, and I'm sorry I'm going to use this derogatory term, but it's what actually was utilized at the time, being seen as a half-breed, Mr. Speaker. And it is a part of my family heritage which has had to have been hidden, Mr. Speaker, hidden in order for us to be able to be accepted and seen as equals to people within our community. It's very difficult to stand up. You're a woman, you're seen as an Acadian. Where have we heard in the media, and I'm not asking for accolations, where have we heard in the media that the first woman Acadian has taken her seat in the legislature? If I was a man and the first Acadian man, do you think that it would have made the news? I'm a woman, Mr. Speaker, and as much as we think that we have come a long way, it's surprising to me, and I think it was quite surprising to the librarians here at the legislature to find out that indeed I am the first Acadian woman to take her seat in this legislature. It may look today as if I come from a place perhaps of what we call, I believe now, white privilege. But I can assure all of you that I grew up in a community had very little means. I was a lucky one. I was lucky. My father left at 13 years old on the back of a coal truck to come up to Halifax to be a bellboy at the Lord Nelson Hotel. And he started working and never stopped from there. And I can assure my good members here at the New Democratic Caucus, I can assure you, as well as I want to assure the member from Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, and Salmon River, who mentioned earlier, that the Progressive Conservative Caucus is very anti-union. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that this Progressive Conservative is not anti-union. In fact, I will say this, it's pretty difficult for me to be anti-union when my father was part of a union that in fact made certain to have a roof over our heads and food in my belly. It would have been a very different experience for me if my father did not have job security that was provided by unions, have a medical plan that was provided by unions, as well as an excellent paycheck. Granted, we paid for that because he was away in Ontario working on the lake boats for 9 months of the year. We paid for it, but thank goodness for that. So I will say thank you, actually, to the unions. My son is also a member of one. He's a member of the ACTRA union. So it is astounding to me as well, considering that we seem to have something called the right of being able to have free association in this country, that a government can also make people, administrators, or now I believe we're supposed to call them managers, extract themselves from a union for which they have been members for 120 years or more. There's never been any conflict within that union between administrators, for which I will continue to call them, and teachers, because they're one and the same, Mr. Speaker, as much as this government would like for us to believe that they are not. They are one and the same. They are all teachers. They are all trying to do their best for the children within the classrooms. I don't believe that it's fair and just that you force people who have had no conflict with one another, that you force them to separate from the same established union. Force them out, get them into an association. They have no idea, Mr. Speaker, of whether or not they'll have benefits after they retire. They have no idea right now, these administrators or managers, whether or not who's going to negotiate contracts on their behalf. They have no idea, Mr. Speaker, that after February of next year, or whenever it is that they're supposed to decide whether or not they want to stay within or affiliated with the NSTU, what will happen after that if they decide that they don't want any affiliation? What will happen? We don't have questions to that. It's almost a little bit like this morning when I was going down the stairwell to get to the underground parking in my apartment complex, and the lights went out. The lights went out and it went pitch black in the stairwell, Mr. Speaker. And I had to feel my way around. Good thing I have actually good visual memory, to be able to make myself, get down the stairwell safely and then go through the garage and find my vehicle in the dark. It feels a little bit, Mr. Speaker, like we're all flailing in the dark right now, trying to feel our way around as far as, how all of this imaginary system that this legislation proposes is going to work. Because right now, that's kind of like what it is, Mr. Speaker. It's all imaginary. This association doesn't exist. It's starting up from scratch, and yet they're supposed to be a part of it sometime very soon. The package of information that we have in front of us as far as a new centralized school board, that's all imaginary as well. We have no idea how that structure is actually going to be outlined, what it looks like, what the governance model is going to be. It's all imaginary, like a child's storybook, right? Imaginary land. That's what it feels like. It's imaginary land. I was actually at one of the schools, very privileged to go to one of the schools, and I apologize, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take a drink right now. Of water, that is. Later. I would just like to say, Mr. Speaker, I felt very privileged recently to go into a school within the Strait Regional School Board and read to one of the classes there, and I read in one of the French immersion, early French immersion classes, and how much joy it brought to me to be able to actually participate with children and read with them, because one of my greatest joys in bringing up my son was reading, storytelling, reading. And I'm happy to say that he's become a lifelong reader. He's as a ferocious reader as I am. And I had brought some storybooks with me in French, and the children were very excited. It's obviously their teacher takes a lot of time to be able to read to them. And in fact, when I arrived, they were all sitting very quietly at their desks and reading their own individual books. Now, I asked them if they could actually come up and see the selection of books that I brought with me, and I asked them, which one would you like for me to read? And they kind of hesitated a little bit, hummed and hawed, and then they said, well, Madame Pong, we'd really like for you to, read this story to us. And it was a story that the teacher had actually read to them several times, and yet they wanted it read again. And the book was actually in English, and I'm so glad actually that the students asked me to read it. It's called I Am Malala. And it's the girl who stood up for education and was shot by the Taliban. It's quite a moment for me, Mr. Speaker, that young children really understand the value in being able to stand up, in being able to be very forthright, to show bravery and strength and conviction, that even though someone is trying to take your rights away, someone is trying to oppress you, you will stand up for what you think is right, even though it may not be the popular vote. It may not make you popular. And in fact, you may have to stand up and say, there's some things that I won't even agree with, maybe with the rest of my mates here. You may actually hear me screaming every once in a while in the back chamber. I'm French, I'm very passionate. But, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we all need to, as elected officials, keep our focus on who it is that votes us in. And it is the people of Nova Scotia that asks for us, in fact, should demand of us, to make certain that we are representative of what they want to see as changes in this House and in the legislature, which will affect Nova Scotians for gosh knows how much time to come. This is 60-page legislation we're looking at here. I wrote my LSATs, when I was doing my internship at the National Capital Commission years and years ago. I had thought about going to law school. My father was very happy. He was thinking that he'd have a lawyer in the family. I probably should have gone, Mr. Speaker. It would have made it a lot easier to go through 60 pages within a couple of days. No, don't do it. My colleague here is telling me not to do it. It would have made it a lot easier, Mr. Speaker, to go through this legislation. We really need more time. We need more time to be able to ingest all of this information, to be able to make responsible decisions, and to respond in a way that reflects what it is the people are asking of us. How on earth are we to make responsible choices when we only have such a short period of time to make decisions about legislation that would affect the very, very citizens who are the most vulnerable? Our children. Do we not think that that was worth taking a bit more time to hash it out? I do, Mr. Speaker. We need to be given more time when legislation comes across our desk that is so vast, so vast. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that in my case and in the case of many young girls across the world, and again today is International Women's Day, for the Acadians, for the Indigenous population, for the African Nova Scotians, for the Gaels, for the English, for the Scottish, and anyone else that I have forgotten to mention here today, I want to tell you this. Education, Mr. Speaker, equals freedom. It equals freedom. It has given me my freedom, Mr. Speaker. If anybody's taken a look at my website, they'll see a picture of me now and a picture of me on my first day of school, or maybe the second. I got a lunch can in one hand that has a big piece of string holding it up together. It used to be my dad's lunch can. And a satchel in the other that used to belong to my sister, and that's being held together with a piece of rope too, because that's all we could afford. And I was happy to get it, Mr. Speaker. Never would I complain once. In fact, I was very proud that I had the opportunity to take my sister's school bag to school. Education is equal to freedom, Mr. Speaker, and democracy is equal to freedom. And we should never permit, as members of this House, for any aspect of our democracy to be stolen away with a stroke of the pen. Stand up. Stand up, Mr. Speaker. Stand up, Nova Scotia. Stand up and do something about it. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat. Thank you.